Good morning, everybody. My name is Gottfried Hagen. I'm a professor of Turkish studies here at Michigan, here in the Department of Middle East Studies. And I also have the honor to direct the Center for Armenian Studies. And in that function, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's workshop. I wanted to say a few words about the Center and Armenian Studies here at Michigan, and then turn it over to Bogdan. So Armenian Studies here at Michigan is sort of the famous three-legged stool. It's based on two endowed professorships, one in the Department of History, one in the Department of Middle East Studies. And then the third leg is the Center for Armenian Studies. That is housed in the International Institute. We do a lot of academic programming. We do community relations. But one of the sort of long-lasting things or long-term things we're doing is we regularly house postdoctoral fellows. The Menuhian Fellowships in Armenian Studies. And our fellows get to, get to teach on a as part of their fellowships in their host departments, and they also get to organize a workshop around their topics. And so it's my and I can let me just say from the perspective of a director who's not himself an Armenologist, this has been just amazing learning opportunity for me. And these are some of the highlights of my experience as director. And so I've been very much enjoying this, and I'm looking forward to today's workshop organized by Bogdan Pavlich, who came to us as postdoctoral fellowship after getting his PhD from Northwestern. And I think I don't have to say much about his field and specialization because you're all familiar with him. And so with that, I want to turn the podium over to him with one more thing I want to say, I forgot, is that Armenian Studies here is also very much community driven. So both the professorships are endowed, and also our center has been regularly funded by community donors. So this is something we've always grateful for, and something that we hope we will be able to continue. Okay, now let me turn it over to Bogdan to kick us off here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gottfried, for the introduction. Thank you so much for being here, for coming here. I'm really excited about the workshop and all the discussions that we are looking forward to today. I would like to say thank you to our co-sponsors at the University of Michigan, the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, Institute for the Humanities, Department of Middle Eastern Studies, Department of History, History of Art, Medieval and Early Modern Studies. Then I also want to say thank you to Gottfried Viken and Michael Piper, who were very helpful and really supportive of my clumsy attempts to organize this workshop. I really appreciate it. As they probably know, it was a very challenging enterprise for me, but also very rewarding. And now, if I learned anything from this experience, it's that I started to appreciate the work of the Center for Armenian Studies even more, for all the organizing and collaboration of such academic events. I also want to thank our discussants, Valerie Kivelson and Helmut Puff, for being generous with their time. They're both on leave this year, but they are with us today, and they will be commenting on the papers. Thank you all to the participants for coming, bracing the cold weather and coming to Michigan in the end of February, which sounded incredible to me when I learned about the date of the workshop. I couldn't imagine someone would come to to Michigan in February. But no, thank you so much, really. And your enthusiasm and responsiveness to my requests and emails was really a great source of confidence for me when I was working on this workshop. And that was probably one of the most enjoyable parts to sort of to get in touch with you, to learn about your research, and to discuss your papers today. Now, the workshop itself, I think, is more or less sort of self-explanatory. You'll have the program. I'm not going to explain the whole structure, but I just want to say that this is, I mean, the whole idea is not super original. I was inspired by other similar workshops and collaborations that are happening, especially in Europe, on the Catholic Orthodox exchanges, on relations between the Catholic Church and Eastern Christians in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and in other parts of the world in the early modern period. So it's not necessarily a very original idea, but I think it has its merit to have this workshop here, because I think we don't have that much discussion of these issues in the US for some reason. So it was very interesting to me to bring this subject to the American sort of academic stage. And also, I think it's important to have this workshop here at the Center for Armenian Studies, because Armenians were one of the most actively involved in these exchanges between Catholicism and Eastern Christianities in the early modern period and later. And I think it's really interesting to sort of to bring these topics, these papers, to our audience at the center and to discuss it here at Michigan. Okay, and now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Cesare Santus. Cesare teaches early modern history at the University of Trieste in Italy. He earned his PhD, a joint PhD from Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa and École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. He held postdoctoral and research fellowships in Italy and Belgium, including one at the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies at Villa Itati in Florence. Cesare works on the history of interconfessional relations in the early modern period, from the 16th to 18th century in the Ottoman Empire and the wider Mediterranean world. He published two books, co-edited two collected volumes, and wrote many more articles dealing with different aspects of this very dynamic field of research. I just want to highlight one of his books that was published in 2019, the Trasgressione necessarie comunicatio in sacris coesistenza e conflitti tra le comunità cristiane orientali e Levante Impero Ottomano 600-700, which is a very fascinating study of interconfessional relations between the Catholics and Eastern Christians, especially with the focus on Greeks and Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. One of the reviewers of this book called it a brilliant and comprehensive study based on the most exhaustive research that deserves to remain the standard text on the subject it covers. So it's a really fascinating study that focuses on this phenomenon of communicatio in sacris, that is the participation of Catholics in non-Catholic rituals and vice versa. And Cesare approaches this very sort of formal, usually considered a legal problem from a perspective of a cultural historian or religious historian of religion, and shows the very sort of dynamic and messy reality of interconfessional relations on the ground in everyday life. He also uses a very interesting corpus of sources for this research, especially the one that is at the archive of the Holy Office in Rome, so known as the Roman Inquisition. It's indeed a very fine-grained research in terms of sources, but also of analysis. And a great deal of Cesare's research, including his book, addresses the Armenians in all these interactions between Catholicism and Eastern Christianity. And this is something that he will talk today in his keynote address, titled "Education, Confession, and Devotion: Shaping Armenian Catholicism in Early Modern Empire." And I would like to invite Cesare here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So what can I say? I'm very happy and truly honored to be here. And I would like to start by thanking, obviously, Bogdan Pavlich and Gottfried Hagen for inviting me, and Viken Muradian for the excellent organization and his help in organizing my journey here from Italy. So as you may know, I cannot define myself as a proper Armenologist, but rather as a historian of early modern Catholicism who over the years has developed a growing interest in the birth and development of the Eastern Catholic churches, with a special focus on the Armenian one. So that's why I enthusiastically accepted Bogdan's invitation with the aim of sharing with you today my past and present research on this topic, but also to discuss with you a thorny, let's say, issue. So in what ways can conceptual categories related to the theory of confessionalization prove useful for studying religious communities formed in times and places beyond 16th century Western Europe? This question can first be answered through a historiographical review, as I have attempted to do in a forthcoming essay, where I reconstruct the emergence of the confessional paradigm in 1980s German historiography, the growing criticism it has faced in subsequent decades, and its recent resurgence in the works of historians working on the religious context of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, such as Diana Kristic, Alphonse Brüning, Bernard Berger, and many others. If we specifically consider the Armenian Church, Sebou Haslanian's latest latest book on the relationship between the early modern Armenian printing and the Armenian diaspora, demonstrates how confessionalism served, as they say, as the driving engine of the story it tells. But the same question can also be addressed in a different way, in a more concrete way, linked to specific case studies. And today, building also on this historiography, I would like to look at the Armenians of Constantinople and Ottoman Anatolia at the turn of the 18th century. I will argue that contact with Catholic missionaries not only created a rift within these communities, but also, over time, led to the construction of two distinct and opposing confessional identities, overcoming previous ambiguities and the efforts of those who did not want to choose between Rome and Echmiadzin. So, during the 17th century, a new wave of Catholic missions organized under the auspices of the Congregation de Propaganda Fide, the Congregation of Propaganda, began targeting the Christian communities of the Near East. And among some of them, especially the Armenian and Arabic-speaking ones, the missionaries achieved fair success. This can be attributed to several reasons, such as their novel cultural and religious preparation, but also their willingness to tolerate a degree of ambiguity among newly converted individuals. In practice, the missionaries were content to receive people into the Catholic faith during confessions, often requiring from the penitent only a simple promise to adhere to the teachings of the ancient church fathers. So this approach avoided contentious doctrinal disputes stemming from later divisions, which were largely attributed in this perspective to the ignorance in which Eastern Christians were believed to have fallen under the Muslim yoke, as it was called. Moreover, the new allegiance of faith, this new allegiance of faith did not require converts to stop attending their national churches, as the practice of communicatio in sacris was already defined as, we may say, shared cross-confessional worship was widely tolerated. The underlying strategy was that of the Trojan horse, as it was called. That is to secretly convert as many individuals as possible, particularly within the higher ranks of the Eastern clergy, without necessarily splitting them from the church of origin, which was the only one officially recognized by the Ottoman authorities. Once a sufficient number of Catholic prelates had been secured in key positions, the union of the Eastern churches with Rome would take place spontaneously and without trauma. That was the idea. Or this project was obviously unrealistic, and it often led to controversy. For instance, in 1636, following the uproar caused by the union of the Armenians of Lviv with Rome, some members of the Armenian clergy in Constantinople grew suspicious of the Dominican missionary Paolo Piromalli, who had begun preaching in Armenian churches there, dressed as a vardapet, and Piromalli was seeking to avoid confessional disputes. But he was identified as a Catholic when he refused to recite the final anathema attached to the Armenian version of the Nicene Creed, as it has been studied recently by Anna Ohanjanian. Nonetheless, in the second half of the 17th century, this Trojan horse strategy achieved some success, thanks also to the crucial role played by the French monarchy, the protector of Catholicism in the Levant. In Constantinople, the European missionaries and the Armenian Catholic clergy, educated in Rome, cultivated good relations with the Armenian apostolic hierarchy, while tolerating the practice of communicatio sacris. One notable example is the Vardapet Khachatur Arakelian, a pupil of the Urbanian College, the College of Propaganda, who managed to gain the trust of the Patriarch of Constantinople, Mekhitar Hyrtistansi, so much so as that he was appointed as his vicar, preaching regularly in the cathedral and organizing Armenian liturgies during which the name of the Roman pontiff was mentioned and water was added to the chalice. However, the growing number of Catholic converts in Constantinople did not lead to the union of all the local Armenians with Rome. Instead, it created a rift within the community, marked by periodic outbreaks of violence and an ongoing struggle between the two factions to gain control of the patriarchal seat, often by offering the highest bribe, we may say, to Ottoman officials. From the early 18th century onwards, the previous supple and somewhat ambiguous strategy of the missionaries was gradually replaced by a more intransigent attitude, aimed at establishing clear-cut boundaries, preventing Catholic converts to enter the Armenian churches and fueling confessional clashes. So I have explored elsewhere the various reasons behind this shift in attitude, including the contemporary doctrinal controversies that tore apart the Catholic missionary world in the Far East. Just think of the Chinese rights controversy, or the political and military crisis faced by the Ottoman government at the time. Today, I would like to focus more on how this transformation took place, specifically on the process of confession building. What intellectual and practical tools were employed to shape a distinct and exclusive Armenian Catholic identity? What was the reaction of the Armenian apostolic hierarchy to that? A brief disclaimer: the adjective apostolic to designate the traditional Armenian church reflects a later usage with respect to the period I'm speaking of, when the difference between Catholics was rather emphasized through the reference to the figure of Saint Gregory the Illuminator, as we will see. But for the sake of simplicity and clarity, I decided to imply this term apostolic, which has become the modern official label. So, in the development of a new community of converts, we may identify three main axes: education, confession, and devotion. Under the first term, education, I include both the general and religious instruction provided by Catholic missionaries through their personal preaching and teaching, as well as the broader impact of the circulation of books published in Armenian. The second axis, confession, refers to the drafting of detailed confessions of faith by both the Catholic and Apostolic clergy, requiring the faithful to publicly recite, sign, and accept their doctrinal content. Finally, devotion encompasses the daily religious practices and the promotion of models of sainthood, which were designed to instill a strong sense of confessional belonging in the hearts of the faithful. So let's see how the Armenian communities of the Ottoman Empire experienced at the turn of the 18th century an evolution in these three domains, passing from ambiguity to identification, from pragmatic coexistence to confessional controversy. Education has long been a key tool of proselytism. The schools for children established by Catholic missionaries in the Levant were generally welcomed by the Eastern Orthodox clergy, and in this regard, the Armenian Church is no exception. One of the reasons for their success was the novelty of European-style teaching, which began with non-polemical topics. Upon arriving in new Eastern communities, 17th century missionaries taught pupils both neutral, general subjects like grammar or arithmetic, as well as the fundamental principles of the Christian faith, initially avoiding controversial arguments. Between 1640 and 1644, the Theatine missionary Clemens Galanus, sought to enhance this form of teaching by directly addressing the seminarians of the Armenian Patriarchate. Thanks to his renowned scholarship and his habit of dressing like a bardapet, he succeeded in gaining semi-official recognition from the apostolic clergy and even taught some future patriarchs. But this experience didn't last long. More successful were the schools and catechism classes organized by the Jesuits at the end of the century. In their didactic and apostolic activity, the missionaries relied on a fundamental tool that for a long time remained an European monopoly: print. As the Jesuit active in Izmir once wrote, books have this advantage over missionaries. They penetrate everywhere, announce the truths of the faith without fear, cost little, and are very useful. During the 17th century, the majority of books in Oriental languages printed in Rome, Venice, and other cities, mainly under the control and censure of Catholic authorities, had religious themes, predominantly consisting of editions of biblical, liturgical, hagiographic, or devotional texts, such as the Armenian version of the Imitatio Christi and of the Catechism by Robert Bellarmine. These works were produced by a team of Armenian translators based in Rome under the aegis of the Congregation de Propaganda, namely Barseg Barsegyan and Hovannes Konstantopolsitsi, Vannes Olov. In addition, some European missionaries were able to compose original works directly in classical Armenian, in Krapar. This is the case, for example, of the Jesuit Jacques Billotte. This Frenchman, best known as the author of an Armenian-Latin dictionary published in Rome in 1714, also provided his confrère Nicolas Frison with the documentary material to publish a detailed history of the Jesuit mission in Persia and Eastern Anatolia, where the proselytism strategies employed by the missionaries at the time were described. Based on Billotte's original reports and published under his name, Frison's account reveals that while Billotte was active in Erzurum in the early 1690s, he sought ways to impress the fundamental notions of Catholicism upon the minds of Armenian children so that they would not forget them. And I quote, "The method he devised, which proved to be highly effective, was to adapt the Christian doctrine into a kind of board game, much like the game of the goose. He provided the rules and taught the children how to play. The game consists of 46 circles arranged in a spiral pattern on a large sheet of paper. Each circle contains an emblem or symbol representing a mystery of one of the major truths of our religion. In this way, all the essential points of Christian doctrine are explained in the 46 circles in a useful and entertaining way. Players move their marker to the circle indicated by the dice roll, then describe the emblem, explain the mystery it represents, and elaborate on it in their own words. For instance, circles 39 and 40 represented venial and mortal sins, respectively. The first was depicted with an image of a tree with a dry branch, while the second showed a man struck dead by a skeleton, the personification of death. Circle 45 featured gold being refined in a crucible, symbolizing purgatory, Kavaran. Villot requested his confrère in Paris to transform his original drawing into an engraving, which was then printed in numerous copies and distributed among the Armenian communities of the empire. So, Villot's catechetical strategy was perhaps even too successful, for in 1692, the Armenian clergy of Erzurum reacted violently against the missionaries' activities, forcing the Jesuits to seek refuge in Constantinople. And in Constantinople, Villot prepared a more detailed explanation of the pictorial emblems, written in a simple form of classical Armenian, designed to be both pure in style, unlike the Latinizing works of other missionaries, and relatively easy to read. The illustrated catechism was not published at the time under Villot's name, but was later printed in Venice by Abbot Mechitar of Sebaste, the founder of the renowned Armenian Catholic monastic order. Although historians following Isaac Genjemian have attributed the Christoniacan Vardapetutian of 1737 to Mechitar's autograph works, Paolo Lucca and I have recently demonstrated in an article that both the text and the images in the volume are identical to those created by Villot 40 years earlier. And attached to the book was the sheet printed in Paris, intended to be used as a game board, just as Villot originally envisioned. Since 1696, the Armenian Catholic community of Constantinople did not have to rely solely on books printed in Europe, as the Armenian typography of Surbeci-Miazzin, Yevsur Sargis Zoravar was established in the city. This press was wanderings between Amsterdam, Livorno, Marseille, and Constantinople have been recently studied with a renewed attention to the confessional dimension by Seboeslanian, was at the time under the supervision of the Armenian Bishop Sargis of Tokat, Sargis Saipchi, and published linguistic and religious works authored by the aforementioned Cacciatura Rachelian, Mechitar of Sebaste, and others. However, with the dawn of the new century, the press began to adapt to the increasingly tense confessional climate. In the spring of 1701, tensions escalated, leading to the arrest of some prominent Armenian Catholics by Ottoman authorities, while others were forced into hiding. The Catholic and Apostolic factions of the community attempted to smooth over their differences through a written agreement. But in 1702, the publication of two sensitive pamphlets risked reigniting hostilities. The first was a brief, very brief booklet, which, I quote, speaks of the indulgences of the new jubilee granted with this word by the Pope. According to Archbishop Gaspare Gasparini, the prelate in charge of the Latin Catholic community of Constantinople, if the Ottoman authorities had become aware of this booklet, they would have believed it to be designed, I quote, to draw the Armenians to the Pope's faith because it is in their language, and this would be a catastrophe for everyone, end quote. The French ambassador of the time, Ferriol, requested that the circulation of the text be suspended until Rome's opinion on the matter could be heard. However, the Jesuit missionaries immediately began distributing it. The second pamphlet was composed by a renowned Jesuit, Pierre-René Ricard, a former companion of Villot. Entitled Theophilos, namely a dialogue between Theophilus and Avardapet concerning truth and devotion, it was a short text printed in 1,500 copies without ecclesiastical authorization nor the author's name, and with Livorno given as the fourth place of publication, which was a common practice of the Sureczmiadzin printing house to avoid trouble with the Ottoman authorities. When the ambassador realized that the book dealt with controversies, he again ordered its dissemination to be stopped, which provoked the furious reaction of the local Jesuit superior. The concern of the Catholic authorities was not exaggerated. In the course of the following years, confessional clashes became more and more violent, especially under the tenures of the Armenian Patriarch Avedik Yevdokiatsi. Catholic-inspired texts published by the printing house, such as The Spiritual Garden, Parteso Gevor, or the Armenian translation of the Imitatio Christi by Thomas à Kempis, became then an explicit target. In 1703, the Patriarch's deputy, Hovhannes Izmirtsi, ordered his flock to collect and publicly burn them, since they were perverse. In addition to repression and prohibition, such as the frequent use of ecclesiastical excommunication against those promoting the printing and dissemination of this kind of Catholic books, the Armenian Apostolic Church also countered Catholic propaganda by launching a parallel and rival publishing initiative. And in Constantinople, this effort was entrusted to the printer Grigor Marzvanetsi, on which Daniel Ohanian will speak later today, so I will not say more on that. However, for a long time, Catholics had the upper hand, and their prevailing position, from this point of view, was further strengthened by the intense publishing activity promoted by the Mekhitarist order. Under the sole care of Abbot Mekhitar, 55 volumes were published in the first half of the 18th century, including not only liturgical or spiritual books, catechisms, devotional texts, etc., but also grammatical and lexical ones. Mekhitar and his disciples from the Venetian monastery of San Lazzaro can hardly be considered part of a confessionalizing movement. Their behavior was rather the expression of a sensitivity that from today's perspective could be described as ecumenical, which aimed at promoting a full communion between the Roman and the Armenian churches while preserving the Armenian tradition and cultural heritage and without tearing apart its ecclesiastical body. From this point of view, one understands why Mekhitar was pretty much dismayed by the 1742 Vatican decision to establish an Armenian Catholic Patriarchate, which created a separate hierarchy in competition with the official Armenian Church. As a consequence, the Mekhitarists were long treated with hostility by the more intransigent fringes of the Catholic world, precisely because they were suspected of maintaining overly friendly relationships with the schismatics. However, they eventually became a polemical target for traditional apostolic Armenians too, as well. Indeed, it was also through confrontation with them, confrontation with the Mekhitarists, and attempts to limit their cultural influence, that the confessional awareness of the Armenian Apostolic Church was eventually forged. One of the distinctive features of the confessional age is the emphasis on creeds, normative texts, which allowed individuals to publicly affirm their belonging to a distinctly defined religious community, separated from rival groups. This phenomenon gained prominence in the 17th century among Eastern Christians as well, who, in the wake of theological controversies between Catholics and Protestants in Europe, were increasingly urged to formalize their beliefs, to take a stand on the most controversial issues of the time. In the early 1670s, Charles-Marie François Ollier de Nointel, the French ambassador at the time with the Sublime Porte, was tasked with collecting as many confessions of faith as possible from prelates of the various Eastern churches. The primary goal of this initiative was to demonstrate that the Christian East, which was regarded by many in Europe at the time as the heir of the early Apostolic Church, aligned with the Catholic Church on the doctrine of transubstantiation, that is, the transformation of the bread and wine into the actual body of Christ, thereby refuting the Calvinist claim that this was a medieval papist innovation. By mobilizing both the French consular and missionary network, Nointel managed to obtain, among others, the professions of faith of the Armenian Bishop of Cairo, of the rich merchant community of New Julfa, and above all, of the Catholicos Jacob I. These statements, as well as the letters of homage to Rome provided by many Eastern bishops and patriarchs to European missionaries, often in the hope of gaining political or economic support, proved obviously valuable in the polemic against Protestants. But they were frequently considered incomplete or insufficient when measured against the increasingly strict criteria established after the Council of Trent to assess the true Catholicity of groups and individuals. And it's for this reason that as early as the late 16th century, the Holy See began drafting official and increasingly detailed formulas, which became the sole acceptable standard for achieving ecclesiastical communion with Rome. For the Armenians, this process led to the publication of 4 distinct Armenian or Armenian Latin Catholic confessions of faith within the span of a century. These texts were not employed only by missionaries in the Levant, in the East. In fact, their most systematic use took place at the very heart of Western Christianity, in Rome. During the 17th and especially 18th century, an increasing number of Eastern Christians managed to have a direct experience of the Pope's city of Rome. They might be travelers, merchants, diplomatic envoys, but more frequently they were ordinary pilgrims, driven by a desire to visit the See of St. Peter for spiritual reasons, to obtain ecclesiastical dispensations from the Pope, to seek material help from the Roman Curia. Some works in Armenian language were printed precisely to help and foster this kind of pilgrimage. For example, in 1725, the Armenian Bishop of Sebaste, Onan Yayan, and his brother Oran published through the Oriental Typography of Propaganda a translation of the most famous travel guide to Rome, La Guida Angelica Perpetua per visitare le chiese che sono dentro e fuori Roma, originally conceived in 1629 as a practical leaflet for pilgrims. Along with that, another pamphlet was published at the time, a pamphlet that encouraged pilgrims, Armenian pilgrims, to take advantage of the special indulgences of the Jubilee by visiting the city's main churches and sanctuaries. During their stay in Rome, the Armenian pilgrims were hosted in an hospice next to the church of Santa Maria Egiziaca, a place of worship especially dedicated to the Armenian rite by Pope Pius V in 1566. The rules of this hospice were very strict, requiring each guest to make an explicit profession of Catholic faith, first in the hands of the confessor of the place, until about 1650, when they were forced to take this profession of faith in the palace of the Holy Office, that is, before the Roman Inquisition. Taking professions of faith, which consisted in the reading and subscription of the printed formula prepared under Pope Urban VIII, was often the only way for Eastern Christians to be accepted in Rome, or to see their demands for spiritual and often material aid taken into consideration. These professions were conserved in special registers kept in the archives of the Inquisition, which represent a mine of information for the historian. They included the name, patronymic, age, place of origin, and personal signature of those who appeared before the Inquisitor, providing valuable data of the number of Eastern Catholics who reached Rome each year, the peak periods of pilgrimage, and the regions of the Levant from which most of them departed. And based on these sources, I'm currently building a prosopographical database of which I can show you some preliminary partial data. So, for instance, in the period from 1681 to 1710, we count 399 Armenians, a number significantly higher than any other Eastern Christian community. In comparison, in the same span of 30 years, only 59 Greeks professed the Catholic faith. Among the places of origin, the most recurring names were those of the most densely populated cities, obviously, starting, of course, with Constantinople, then Isfahan, because of the Armenian neighborhood of New Julfa, Tokat, Erzurum in Anatolia, Aleppo in Syria, and then the areas of historical Greater Armenia, including the Catholic enclave of Nakhichevan. The average age of the subscribers of these pilgrims was 35. Most were laymen, though there were also clerics and occasionally high prelates, such as the bishops of Cyprus, Kayseri, Erzincan, Izmir, etc. Depending on their confessional status, they were not treated in the same way. Those who came from an apostolic background had to recite a full-fledged profession of faith, while those who could prove to be already Catholics were only required to repeat a shorter profession, Iuxta formam Armenis unitis prescriptam, a shorter profession for Catholics. After that, their names were recorded and they were issued a certificate. This process was developed to keep under control the confessional identity of Eastern Christians passing through Rome, but also as a means of social discipline for mobile foreigners. For example, when an individual approached the Roman Curia seeking economic assistance, officials could check whether the person had previously declared their Catholic faith and gather additional information regarding their reputation. And this was possible, obviously, it was made possible through the linguistic mediation of the Armenian Catholic prelates living in Rome, living in the city, where they had come fleeing the sectarian violence of the Ottoman Empire, and sometimes hoping to restart in Rome the ecclesiastical career they could no longer pursue in their original community after the conversion. Here you see some of the tombstones which were originally in the Armenian Church of Rome and now are at the Pontifical Armenian College of some of these people I'm talking about. Until now, I also take this opportunity to let you know that the rich inquisitorial material on Eastern Christianity, including Armenians, is at the heart of a forthcoming book I co-edited, it should be out in May, which rightly focus on the Inquisition, the Christian East, and I hope it will be of your interest. So until now, I've primarily focused on the Roman strategy of confession building for Armenian converts. But the Apostolic Church did not remain indifferent to the spread of Catholicism among its faith. During the confessional clashes of the early 18th century, the Armenian patriarchs of Constantinople, Yeprem Rapansi and then Avedik Yevdokiatsi, petitioned the Ottoman authorities to imprison the leading members of the Armenian Catholic group, labeled in Armenian as Ahtarma, from the Turkish word for convert, or labeled as Frank, as the European were called in the Ottoman Empire. Their homes were searched and they were arrested at the exit of the churches run by the missionaries. Episodes of outright inquisition and confessional surveillance then took place in Constantinople in an attempt to persuade the faithful to reject Catholic beliefs and instead make public professions of adherence to the distinctive Miaphysite precepts of the Armenian Church. For instance, suspected Catholics were summoned to the Armenian Church of the Holy Mother of God, Sobab Tzatzatsin, located in the Kumkapı district, where they were compelled to deny the doctrine of the two natures in Christ, or to recite the hymn O Marvelous, which included some curses against the Council of Chalcedon and Pope Leo the Great. It is probably within this context that a confession of faith for those who come from error to truth was prepared, adopting an explicitly anti-Catholic stance. This text, written in a question and answer format, has not survived in its original Armenian version, but only as a contemporary Latin translation, probably probably composed by a Catholic missionary, as it is suggested by the document's location in the Roman archive of the Society of Jesus, in the Jesuit archives of Rome. This formula, this profession, was employed when Armenian Catholics were persuaded, rather forced, to reintegrate into the Armenian Apostolic Church during a kind of inquisitorial examination in which the penitents were questioned regarding their belief on the single nature in Christ or the value of the Council of Chalcedon. They were also required to commit to abstaining from any interaction with the European and Armenian Catholic missionaries, but the text itself goes much farther, outlining what we consider the complete set of beliefs necessary to be deemed a true Orthodox Apostolic Armenian, or rather, following a neologism which was probably invented right at the time, alusavorchadavan, namely someone professing the faith of Saint Gregory the Illuminator, the founding father of the Armenian Church. Finally, penitents who were readmitted in this way into the ecclesiastical communion with the Armenian Church were required to seal their confession of faith with their own signet ring and hand over the signed text for safekeeping. The violent tone of this confession of faith far exceeds the average level of polemic. For instance, while it was customary to assert the autonomy of the See of Echmiadzin with respect to Rome, while still granting to Rome a primacy of honor, let's say, so the See of St. Peter, the first of the apostles, the chief of the apostles, these kind of things, this text explicitly required the penitent to affirm that the Armenian See, Echmiadzin, was greater than Rome, I quote, as a master to his servant. It is also worth noting a point that caused significant controversy at the time. Among the contentious beliefs penitents were required to profess was that Christ was free from the flow of the belly, meaning that he ate and drank without excretory functions due to the special and glorious nature of his body. This idea had been originally advanced by Nerses Shnorahali and Vardana Egekci in the 12th century and later developed by Grigor Tatevatsi, but it was not particularly widespread, somewhat deemed extreme. According to a French Jesuit missionary, the emphasis on this point stemmed from the author of the profession of this text, who was not a clergyman, but a layman named Turciugiolu. Not least because of this detail, because the surname literally means son of a pickleman, even those who had no sympathy for the Catholic faith expressed some reservations about this confession of faith. While this text was not the work of a well-educated theologian, in the years at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, confessional polemics on the Apostolic Armenian side saw the production of much more refined and articulate polemical treatises authored by Yeremia Kymurchan, Hovhannes Merkuz Jurayetsi, Georg Mklaim Mori, and Catholicos Razar Jakretsi, among others. The need not to limit the work of confessional entrenchment to scholarly controversy increasingly drove both Catholic and Apostolic Armenians into the composition and dissemination of works that could also be understood by a wider public, uneducated public, so written in the vernacular Armenian, Ashkarabar, or in Armeno-Turkish. And on this point, I refer to the splendid work that Anna Ohanjanian is carrying out on the apology of the Armenian Church by Yeremia Kymurchan. The shift toward confessional separation mainly affected daily religious life, particularly fasting, attending Mass, and receiving the sacraments. During the first decades of the 18th century, the Roman authorities increasingly forbade Catholic faithful from attending Armenian churches, claiming that participation in the liturgy of the schismatics was a grave sin that could jeopardize the newly embraced faith of the converts. So, contrary to a long-standing tradition of communicatio in sacris, it was no longer possible to conceal one's confessional affiliation. Instead, Catholics were now required to publicly affirm their faith and belonging, even if this involved retaliation or exclusion from the community. Many missionaries in Constantinople, both European and Armenian, supported this principle, even if they disagreed on a crucial point. The Jesuits wanted to keep a strict control on the religious life of Armenian Catholics, as their alms represented an important source of income. To this end, they encouraged Armenian Catholics to attend only the church of the society, their church in Galata, while organizing confraternities and groups of female devotees wholly committed to the teachings of their spiritual fathers. Conversely, the Armenian pupils of Propaganda Fide, the Armenian clergy trained in Rome, sought some autonomy for them and for their faithful, cultivating the ultimate goal of obtaining, sooner or later, the permission to erect a place of worship entirely managed by Armenian Catholics. In any case, the reaction of the Apostolic Church was harsh. If Catholic converts could go more or less secretly to the European missionaries for confession or to receive the Eucharist, they usually had to resort to the official apostolic clergy for all those sacraments that had civil effects, we may say, that is, those rituals that sanctioned an individual's membership within their community. However, under the Patriarch's order, Armenian parish priests began to withhold the rites and ceremonies of baptism, marriage, and funerals from those suspected of attending European churches. In the eyes of the Ottoman authorities, this exclusion soon acquired a political meaning, while the apostolic clergy fomented accusations of treason, political treason, against Armenian Catholics. In an attempt to improve the condition of the Armenian Catholic community, in 1706, the French ambassador Ferriol orchestrated the kidnapping of the Patriarch of Abedic, the Patriarch Abedic, secretly shipping him to France. I will not dwell here on this well-known story, but rather focus on the disastrous consequences of this extreme measure. Not only did it fail to alleviate the persecution of Catholics, but it actually worsened the situation. The local apostolic factions wrote a petition to Catholicos Alexandre Jureț, requesting the return of Abedic's former vicar, the ruthless Hovhannes Izmirtsi, who had meanwhile sought refuge in Echmiadzin, and demanding the solemn excommunications of individuals listed as destroyers of our precepts set by the Illuminator, corruptors, despisers, and blasphemers of our church, end quote. When Hovhannes Izmirtsi arrived in Constantinople, he easily exploited the scandal caused by Abedic's kidnapping to persuade the Ottoman authorities to appoint him as the new patriarch and to condemn 10 of the city's most famous Armenian Catholics to death. 9 of them escaped execution by converting to Islam, with only one preferring death to abjuration. A married priest called Komitas Kyumurchan, collaborator of Mekhitar and brother of the renowned scholar Yeremia Kyumurchan. Beheaded on the 5th of November 1707, Komitas was promptly recognized as a martyr by the local Armenian Catholics, gaining a long-lasting fame of holiness. Although his status was officially sanctioned by the Roman Church only in 1929, so 100 years later, after several previous attempts to achieve the beatification process had failed, the veneration of his memory and burial site inspired widespread popular devotion from the very beginning, and soon became enriched by accounts of miracles attributed to his intercession. The story of Komitas' martyrdom was retold several times and progressively manipulated to make it resemble in all respects the Passion of Christ. In this account, the Ottomans took the role of the Romans, while the Apostolic Armenians were cast as the Jews. This parallel was brought up to the point of including the blood curse from the Gospel of Matthew, According to one of Komitas' biographers, the Grand Vizier was initially reluctant to put him to death and was persuaded to do so only when the Armenian clergy and populace cried, "His blood be on us and on our children." Popular devotion erased all the ambiguous nuances surrounding Komitas, who was a staunch Catholic who nonetheless engaged all his life in communicatio sacris as a priest of the Armenian Catholic Apostolic Church. What mattered then most was presenting him as a victim of the heretics' hatred against the followers of the true faith and of the sole legitimate pastor, the Roman Pontiff. In this sense, the numerous tales of his martyrdom, some of which were composed in Armeno-Turkish and designed to reach the widest possible audience, along with his devotional portraits produced by European and diaspora painters and believed to possess miraculous powers, they all became essential tools in shaping a clear and exclusive confessional identity for Armenian Catholics. A contemporary observer even went so far as to describe Komitas' death as the main watershed between a situation of confessional indifference and one of acute awareness. After the beheading of Komitas, the Armenian Catholics who had previously been used to interact with the heretics separated from them, and the Latin Catholics who until that time had no difficulty at all in attending Armenian churches stopped attending them, as in fact can be seen at the present. From this perspective, the case of Komitas serves as an emblematic example of the broader phenomenon of neo-martyrs. Who were neo-martyrs? Christians sentenced to death by Ottoman authorities, primarily for being accused, rightly or wrongly, of converting to Islam and later renouncing it. The Church celebrated these individuals for refusing to abjure their Christian faith to save their lives. The martyrdom narratives, recounting their stories, often following a stereotypical pattern, played a crucial role in the community-building efforts of both the Greek and the Armenian churches. The nascent Armenian Catholic Church did the same, albeit with a significant distinction. Here, the Islamic mob was replaced by the Apostolic Armenian mob as the primary adversary of the martyr and the culprit of his death. The case of Komitas is particularly interesting also because his later legacy took a different turn from the confessional one illustrated so far. As it has been recently underlined by Henry Shapiro, his tomb became an object of devotion and pilgrimage not just for Catholics, but also for Apostolic Armenians and other religious communities, including Greeks or even Muslim women who visited the cemetery of Balökli, Zeytinburnu in Istanbul, hoping to be healed of illness or sterility. This phenomenon highlights the persistence of devotional practices and the sharing of sacred sites across different communities, reflecting a folk and local religiosity that transcended confessional boundaries. But with respect to the Armenian case, we must add a further and fundamental factor, namely the emergence of a national consciousness that first supplemented and then progressively replaced the defining value of confessional affiliation. While in 1800 Komitas' own grandson could write a dissertation arguing that in the Ottoman Empire the concept of nationhood had an essentially religious significance, and by mid-century many Armenian Catholics could experience the difficulty of combining their confessional and national identity, and here I'm obviously referring to the troubles occurred at the time of Patriarch Andon Asun. At the turn of the 20th century, the rise of nationalism, the crisis of the Ottoman multi-religious system, and finally the genocide changed the situation. According to the promoter of Komitas' beatification process, elevating the Catholic martyr to the altars would have been a glorification of the entire martyred Armenian nation. In this way, what had once been a point of division and confessional controversy was eventually transformed, in the wake of events that threatened the survival of an entire people, into a symbol of unity, and national pride. As I argued at the beginning, I believe that the history of the emergence and consolidation of the Armenian Catholic Church serves as a useful case for examining the role of the confessional factor in the self-understanding of an Eastern Christian community. What emerges is a parabolic trajectory. At the beginning of Catholic missionary penetration among the Armenians, a pragmatic approach prevailed, prioritizing the promotion of the apostolate over the persistence of a certain ambiguity regarding ecclesial belonging. As Catholic ideas and texts were effectively disseminated among the Armenian population, converts were increasingly expected to recognize their affiliation with a faith community distinct from and incompatible with the Apostolic Armenian Church, which in turn built its image also in opposition to the Catholic Church. The formation of exclusive confessional allegiances was then facilitated by the wider historical processes taking place simultaneously in Rome and in Constantinople, demanding that the Ottoman Armenians make a clear choice between the Church of Rome and the Church under the protection of the Sultan. The extreme consequences of this process led, on the one hand, to Roman suspicions of heterodoxy toward those elements of the Armenian Catholic world that sought dialogue with the Armenian Church, while respecting its cultural and liturgical heritage, such as the Mekitarists of San Lazzaro, while on the other hand, some Armenian apostolic clergy went so far as to refuse to consider as genuine Armenians those who did not identify with the Holy Mother Church of Echmiadzin and the faith of Saint Gregory the Illuminator. Reconciliation among all components of the Armenian people became possible only at the end of the 19th century, when the cultural and political climate shifted, giving rise to an ethnically and linguistically based nationalism, along with a reduction in the role of religion in public life. By then, the confessional element had become just one of many defining characteristics of Armenian identity, and not necessarily the most important. Thank you very much.
I was thinking about a little bit more about the archives in Rome. I didn't catch the name. You could go back to the slide. The register.
Those.
Yeah. Yes. This.
A
little bit more about what we found there.
Yeah.
There and what kind of things are registered.
So these are the archives of the Roman Inquisition. The Roman Inquisition, the Holy Office, was established in 1542, mainly for the repression of the Protestant heresy, as it was called, which was spreading at the time in Italy and in the rest of Europe. And so it was a congregation of cardinals, an ecclesiastical body of the Roman Church, which coordinated the work of the inquisitorial courts scattered in the Italian peninsula. But apart from this original, let's say, aim of coordinating trials against the Protestants, in fact, in the 17th and especially 18th century, when the Protestant threat in Italy was no more present, the Holy Office became what we may call the supreme authority in establishing the correct doctrine. So the boundaries of what is licit and not, what is orthodox and not for Catholics. And in this capacity, this congregation received a lot of petitions, questions, files from Catholic penitents, from Catholic authorities scattered into the world, from missionaries, asking what to do in certain cases, and if what they were doing was correct or not. Among these files are also a lot of files concerning Eastern Christianity. For example, if you were a Catholic convert in Syria or in Constantinople, or in Cairo. So in contact with missionaries, because you had to receive the faith from someone, but have a complex situation. So, for example, you were forced to attend non-Catholic churches because there were none, or you were in a complex matrimonial situation, or a lot of different doctrinal or liturgical problems. You might not just be content with talking with your confessor, with your missionary, because your missionary could not do everything. Sometimes you needed to be absolved or to receive an answer directly from Rome. So you had to write to Rome, or in extreme cases, go to Rome to be absolved or to receive an answer. Missionaries themselves had a lot of questions, a lot of doubts, as they were called. So doubtful questions they could not answer. And the only authority that could answer their anxiety on doctrinal issues and also on practical issues like how to behave in this context was the Roman Inquisition. So a lot of many missionaries sent their reports to Propaganda Fide, which was in charge of the missions, but then Propaganda transferred these materials, including Oriental language documents, to the Holy Office, where the doctrinal issues were examined in a way. And because of that, in the archives of the Inquisition, even if many scholars do not know that, there are Eastern language documents, there are a lot of files concerning Eastern Christianity in every possible way, and concerning very different communities from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the Ottoman Empire, Persia, Ethiopia, and much more. And apart from that, these kind of sources concern another part of the activity of the Inquisition, which was the confessional surveillance of the Italian territory, you might say. So people coming to Rome, either Protestants or Orthodox or of any other religion and confessional affiliation, were obviously under the scrutiny of the Inquisition, because theoretically, only Catholics could dwell in Rome. So, especially if you were asking something to Rome, because all these people were in Rome for spiritual or material aid, as I said, literally asking money in a lot of cases. In order to obtain that, or even to be hosted, to be lodged at the Armenian hospice or other Eastern Christian hospices, they were not functioning everything in the same way. It depends on the cases, but in this case at least, they were forced to confess the Catholic faith before the Inquisition, to be examined in a way. It was not because they were necessarily suspicious or there were signs that they were heterodox, but just to be sure in a way. Obviously, if you were an Apostolic Armenian or a Greek Orthodox and you showed up in Rome, then before everything you had to confess the Catholic faith. But even Eastern Catholics themselves, so even those who were already Catholics because they had professed the Catholic faith back in their home, were required to pass through this process. And so studying these sources, which are really registers with, so here I just show Armenian, but there are in any kind of Eastern languages, Georgian, Ethiopian, every kind of Slavic language. You have their name, their surname, their family, and often when they obviously were literate, their signature. So in this case, you see people who could not write, just a cross, but also people who could write and the signature of the interpreter, because obviously it was needed to have an interpreter, a translator. And this kind of translator were these Eastern Catholic prelates who, after conversion, could not more dwell in the East and were looking for a new career and a job. So they transferred to Rome looking for a job, actually. This kind of job. And so, yeah, I'm building up this prosopographical database. It has been a while because it's complex. It's more than 3,000 names. And a lot of different languages, so some I can manage, others no. So I have to ask colleagues, etc. But it's very useful because I can check there a lot. So I have a lot of friends and colleagues asking me, do you happen to know a guy named like that? And I can check and see if it works, at least from 1650 to 1800. From 1650 to 1800, it's, yeah, it works like that.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful talk. I got two questions. The first one about this hypothesis of yours on the transformation of the construction of religious boundaries, which showed on the material of sources that we can maybe place on the level of religious beliefs, on the level of ecclesiastic authorities. So I was wondering if you have the praxeological perspective, can you see it in the daily life?
Yeah. Well,
in the broader sense, the daily life in the sense of how far it went.
So if I can anticipate something, this is a very central point, because I was reflecting on Sergio's paper and on a topic which is like a question which is problematic to me. So what was the specific characteristic of early modern confessional controversy, let's say, compared to previous polemical religious polemic or controversy? Because religious controversy has always existed, okay? What is specific to early modern confessionalization, confessionalism, as you may label it? It's more complicated than that, and I skip that part, but even labels have their history, and it's important to acknowledge that. But apart from that, I believe that this kind of, not just literate elite, but commoners and everyday people engaging in religious issues and being required to take a stand on some points, being scrutinized, being examined, this is really what makes the difference compared to medieval times, for example. And in this sense, we see that in Constantinople, as elsewhere, the protagonists are not just prelates, so clergy, people who have studied, but also commoners, and which really are passionate about these things and are required to take a stance. You refer to the Tusciuciolu or others. And the confessional paradigm implies also that. So not just, well, the state, the authority, the ecclesiastical authority, but also the social discipline of believers and faithful. So yeah, I'm looking also to that. And all this kind of, martyrologies written in a popular language in order to reach everyone, this kind of booklet, or the concern of Villot of creating a game, or even if he has to write a catechism, it should be easy to read, even if in classical Armenian, but easy. All these kind of concerns point in that direction. I don't know if I explain here. Yes, answer.
I also agree with you. I think it would be interesting in this regard to look on different regions, for instance, in Polish Lithuanian Commonwealths, where the Inquisition wasn't that strong as in the western parts, just in terms of social discipline and control and surveillance. It's just interesting to look at this, finding differences, but I agree with you. May I ask you another question? I cannot not ask about fasting, of course, which you mentioned before. Can you explain what exactly was specific about fasting? Because what I see,
this was a typical, even stereotypical in a way, accusation from Eastern churches against Catholic converts, because Catholic converts were accused of doing that, converting themselves, in order to have an easier life. Okay, because ecclesiastical fasting for the Eastern churches, and also the Armenian one, is strict and heavy to carry on. While Catholics were already at the time regarded as people, as having how can I say, an easy way of dealing with these kind of things. So there's a lot of documents and accusation by fellow countrymen and fellow believers, fellow nationals saying, you are a Catholic not just because you do not respect our way of living, but also because you chose a soft way of life. This is not completely true, because Eastern Catholics were required I'm getting to that. Eastern Catholics were required to follow the same rite, in theory, of their fellow nationals, just in communion with the Catholic Church. In practice, it did not work that way. It didn't work that way, for example, when they were living in a Catholic environment. So, for example, if you converted to Catholicism and then came to Rome or lived in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth or elsewhere, it was often required to do not make scandal. So do not scandalize others. So, for example, in theory, they should have respected their own fasting prescriptions and the Latin ones, in order to be faithful to their tradition, but also do not scandalize others. Obviously, this was impossible. This was impossible. It would have been fasting almost every day, or a lot of problems. So, apart from very few, how can I say, hardliners who actually do that, the majority asked for dispensations. Dispensation is the word. So they asked the Roman Inquisition for a special permission to omit, to pass on some liturgical requirements, or these kind of things. That's one of my points.
Yeah. Sorry.
There's an article by Bernard Berger on fasting.
So Cesare, thank you for making that sort of distinction. But what's the difference between early modern and medieval? Since it was one of the questions I wanted to ask. I guess a follow-up question to that was: did the commoners have any idea what was going on or what was happening to them? Because it is so different that, and then have somebody come up and ask you about this, you'd be like,
yeah. So
what is this?
In many cases, not. So, for example, speaking of professions of faith, Rome did know that some of them, actually, even the humblest people coming to Rome, were forced to recite the Confession of Faith, which is a highly detailed confession of faith. They say they recite like parrots. They understand nothing of what they say. So, but please take a minute to explain to that in easier words before making them recite the Confession of Faith. So there was a problem, and there was awareness of that. I cannot say if there was also an answer, a solution of this problem, but it was in their minds, and it was a matter of concern. The fact that religious authorities, Catholic religious authorities, wanted to reach everyone, but also knew that this was pretty hard to achieve.
Right. That's the understanding of what the profession of faith was. But did they understand even the notion of the process of what was being asked? Not like the literal.
No, they knew that, because some of them, they did as the Romans when in Rome, right. and then back in their home restarted doing what they had always done. So as before, as nothing had happened. But this might be a matter of awareness in the early 17th century. In the 18th century, it's not a question of I didn't know. I converted to Catholicism accidentally. No, it's not like that. It's not like that. At a certain point, it's it becomes a fully conscious thing, and it's pretty much serious from both sides, So there are, for example, it's something which struck me. There's a Eastern Christian living in Rome, pretending to be Catholics, but not being real Catholics, who write back in their homeland, denouncing the people who comes and take the profession of faith, saying, beware, when they come back, they are Catholics. So a couple of cases like that. And the Roman Inquisition, when this is discovered, obviously, it's a matter of a serious concern. But for example, I have there's an Armenian case. So this, which is my favorite. So the cover of the book. So you see, this is the envelope of a letter addressed to the Roman Inquisition. Alla Sacra Congregazione del Santo Uffizio, Holy Office, Santo Uffizio in Italian. In Armenian, Sandafitsu. Beautiful. So this envelope contained a letter through which the Armenians of Tokat wrote to Rome saying, beware, there is an Armenian bishop in Rome who acts as a confessor of Armenian pilgrims, but he's not Catholic. He was a collaborator of Avedik in previous years, and still now he writes letters back into the Ottoman Empire for denouncing people who take the confession of faith in Rome. So when they come back, they are persecuted. The strange thing is that the Roman Inquisition did not react to this letter. So the bishop is called Gregorium Gargare in Latin, and Gregor, I don't remember, Gregor something in Armenian, I don't remember, because there's also the Latin translation. Otherwise, the Inquisitor could not have read it. But if the bishop is the one I identified, he remained in place. So they treated that like as a unfounded denunciation. But there's a letter with like 40 seals from the Armenians of Tokat saying, so yeah, so it was a serious thing.
Thank you so much. Interesting. And I have a question about something you brought up in passing, which was ecumenical sensibility. And I'm interested in hearing you say more about what the social locus of that sensibility is or was, and how it is different from the ambiguity that you also sort of alerted us to for the early part of your narrative. I'm thinking that ecumenical sensibility must be a very elite stance. And I'm very interested in the forms in which this was communicated, shared, since it obviously must have been somewhat curricular, but dangerous territory.
So it's complex. It's difficult for me to answer this question, but I must say that the ecumenical position, which is embodied by Mekitar and his disciples, we might say that they chose a very narrow path, but also a very interesting one. So Mekitar, at least himself, not every one of his disciples and later Mekitarian, Mekitar was not ambiguous, never. So he was fully committed to Catholicism and to Rome, but he was also fully committed to keep being Armenian and preserve its Armenianness. The idea was something which, in a way, fit well into the Catholic framework, which was that Eastern Christianity, and in this case, the Armenian Church, was fully compatible with Roman Catholicism, with Catholicism in general, not Roman Catholicism. If you looked at its original core, without taking into consideration, let's say, some erratic degenerations that later, over time, appeared. So looking at Gregory the Illuminator, looking at the church fathers, looking at the original core of the Armenian church, there was no incompatibility at all with Catholicism. Even Mekitar could say, we may look at the Catholic tradition in order to rediscover some parts of our Armenian identity which had fallen into oblivion. So in his opinion, and in this sense, Rome perfectly agreed with him. There was compatibility. Where Rome did not agree was, let's say, practical issues, and mainly the ecclesiastical issues, in the sense recognizing the clergy of the Apostolic Church, interacting with it. Because Mekitar would say, as far as doctrine is concerned, yeah, some of the members of our nation believe something which is not correct from the Catholic point of view. Some others, no. Some others are perfectly orthodox. We must talk with the others, persuade them of the correct stance, and then the union of the Armenian Church and the Roman Church would happen without needing to split from the Armenian Church, create a double rival church, nothing of that. Rome did not believe that possible. And within the Armenian Catholic world, there were some hardliners who became more Roman than the Romans, and so became suspicious of everything which was not clearly Catholic, but in a Latin way more than Catholic way, we may say. Apart from that, some disciples of the Mekitarists behaved in an ambiguous way, not Mekitar. And this obviously fueled some problems. So Mekitar faced the Inquisition a lot of times. Every time he was personally absolved without any charge, but some of his disciples had some problems. Okay, so this is what I can say from the archives and history. Obviously, this was a narrow path because you need a great culture in order to manage the Armenian tradition and the Western Catholic tradition, and create something which is compatible with the two. And not everyone is capable of that. So the Mekitarists of San Lazzaro, because obviously then always dealing with the practical issues, even within the Mekitarist order, there was a split at a certain point. So the Vienna branch of the order, at a certain point, well, the pretext was not just doctrinal issues, it was much more concrete issues like managing the order, the finance, the financial issues of the order. But at the end, what happened was that the Vienna branch of the order was more concerned with the doctrinal orthodoxy and faithfulness to the ecclesiastical magisterium of Rome, and Venice tried to be in between, always pretending to be Catholic and Armenian at the same time without a contradiction. This is not ambiguity, even if some hardliners of the Catholic Armenian world deemed it so. So in the 19th century, there are a lot of pamphlets against the Mekitarists, accusing them of so. One of them, a very famous one, is called Il Mechitarista di San Lazzaro, which is a derogatory pamphlet where Mekitarists are described from the very first page to the last one as hypocrites. Okay, so crypto-apostolic, pretending to be Catholic, but in fact no, etc., etc., etc. So it was debated. It was debated, but as far as Mekitar is concerned, I never found something written by him where I could recognize this kind of ambiguity. He was pretty much clear. even when he advocated for the tolerance of communicatio in sacris, so he presented in face of the Roman Inquisition and asked for a permission. But he sought a permission. He sought not to do that secretly. He asked Rome to sanction that it was possible to go to their Armenian apostolic churches. And the Roman Inquisition said no. And Mekhisdar replied, I think it's a mistake, but I have to apply. Okay?
A limited question, but thank you. This was really interesting. So your list of people who came to Rome seeking favors and so forth, there were women among them?
Women, yeah. Well, no, I can show you later. Yeah, not very many of them. A few of them, actually. Most of them came along men, so with them, like sister of, mother of, wife of. But in a handful of cases, yeah, I found also some women. Because what's interesting in this kind of documents is that you find all levels of society. So all kind of people, really all kind of people, from the bishop and patriarch who show up in Rome to the, I don't know, 80 years old artisan from, sometimes I had a lot of trouble in identifying the places, okay? So because the places are obviously given by those people in Armenian when they spoke, and then the notary of the Inquisition has to write it down in Latin, okay? And obviously he has never heard, if it's Constantinople or Aleppo, fine. But there were like towns in the Caucasus, impossible for me to identify. Or with Anna Wanjanian, I worked. I asked there some advice, and sometimes we succeeded in identifying these places, but were like hamlets with I don't know, 50 people living there. So for sure, people who were not educated, or one of the questions I have is how they came into contact with Catholic missionaries or with Catholicism in general. But then another issue is that some of these people went to Rome without being fully aware of what Catholicism was. Then they had to discover it, but with the idea that the Pope could help them in every possible way. So, for example, a lot of Armenians forced to convert to Islam. It's strange, but it's like that. A lot of Armenians, a lot of renegade Armenians, we may say with the terminology of the time, went to Rome to be absolved, with the idea that the Pope could absolve them better than their own ecclesiastical authorities. And people like coming from the other part of the Mediterranean just for that.
Sorry. No, in a way, I was thinking about this question all along, and you've already now from the last one to point to the. I'm curious about those Armenians who were forced to convert to Islam, where at the point where Emir Komidas Kumirjian was marching, because we are. I mean, there's an inclination. I'm not saying that this is what you're doing, but to consider those conversions as total and finite. But at the same time, there is also the case of the conversion to Islam of Sabbatai Tzvi, almost at the same time.
Earlier.
Within a few decades, right?
Yeah.
And that has also led to the emergence of a crypto-Jewish.
Yeah, no, nothing.
So I'm curious, but I also have a different, a related question. Do you know anything about who administered that conversion? Because I mean, interestingly, Sabbatai Tzvi was converted at the hand of a prominent cleric, Wani event, right? Do we know anything, and that sort of puts him into particular part of sort of Ottoman Islam. Do we know anything?
Yeah, I have to check, but the problem with this kind of tale is to discern between original faithful tales and all those who were fabricated and enriched with a large set of details which were not in. So, but I have to check. But yeah, there's also, because, for example, in order to make it resemble to the story of Christ, there are like 3 passages. So Comitas is brought before one court, and then the other, like Christ before the Roman and before the Pharisaic, etc. So it's the same. And Comitas was brought before the Cadi, but also I'm not sure whether he speaks with the Sheikhul Islam, but I have to check from this point of view. But what I may say is that conversion to Islam was pretty much part of the reality of the time. So it was a scandal for Catholics, but not so much, we may say, because one of them, for example, one of the people who converted to Islam, not Comitas, so one of those who saved his life by converting to Islam, then we find him later in Rome acting as a bishop for so pardoned, okay, friends as before. So yeah, it was acknowledged that it was something tragic, but also that made happen. At least, and this is what Comitas chose a different way, and that's also why he was regarded as a saint from the very beginning. Yeah. On the topic of Armenians converting to Catholicism, to Islam in recent times, and then what became of them and the specific characteristics which survived, even if they at a certain point forgot about their origin. There's a book by Avedi Sajjan, Hidden Nation, is on more recent time, specifically on that.
Actually, I have one question. Actually, 2, but I'm going to ask just about this map. I really like how it shows the sort of the prevalence of Armenians in Rome professing Catholic faith. And you also mentioned that the Armenians saw the Roman Pope as being
not just Armenia.
not just Armenia. I was wondering if there's anything special about Armenians in their relation to Rome.
What's special about Armenians? I've reflected on that, but I'm still. What is particular is that these registers of professions of faith are not specifically conceived for Armenians, but Armenians are the vast majority. Why? Good question. Obviously, I ask myself the same. My answer is that in Rome, the Armenian hospice was the most effective one in forcing its guests in doing that profession, and also the largest one, because the other Eastern Christian hospices in Rome were more like religious houses, convents, or like just a tiny room for lodging representatives from the Eastern churches when they came. So, for example, the Ruthenian hospice, well, it could host a handful of people. In the Armenian hospice, you could have at the same time 30, 40 people living there. And I've seen the registers, a lot of them actually. So in the 18th century, hundreds of people over the year, sometimes even more, passed through the hospice. So if in this hospice they were forced, in order to stay, just in order to be allowed to stay, they were forced to beforehand come to the Holy Office and profess the Catholic faith. That explains, because the other communities were not required in the same way to do that. That's my explanation. But then you have another question. So why how many Armenians went to Rome? Good question. I still have to work on that.
Why wouldn't you?
Right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have one question about the confessions of faith. Are they all uniform? Because there were the Melkites, I saw that the least represented were the Melkites, but there were Melkites who were sending professions of faith according to this book I was reading now, but also and with the caveat of saying that we want to renew the Union of Florence, which had different status, considering the status of the Pope different.
So these kind of formulas, and especially this one, the formula established under Pope Urban VIII, which was then translated in all the possible languages of the Christian East, became the gold standard for converting to Catholicism. So before that, so before 1648, 1630, it depends on the language. Every Christian community, as Eastern Christian prelate, was instructed to recite a profession of faith which could vary, which could change. Okay, so Rome received all these different texts and had to ascertain whether it was legitimate or not, whether it worked or not. And sometimes it did not work. So obviously it was a problem after, I don't know, 1 year of waiting for a text traveling from the Middle East to Rome. You have achieved an union with I don't know, a Syriac or Melkite archbishop. Then you read the text and a point is missing. So you do not know whether on this point that guy thinks like you or not, thinks in an Orthodox way or not. That's a problem. So at a certain point, they established a formula which should not be touched, just translated.
Otherwise, it would be rejected.
Otherwise, it would be rejected. Yeah.
Thank you so much.